Here's why I believe that the fact that in the last election we had the candidates that we had is a sign that something as bad as Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia could happen in our day and age. And I know that's a very wild claim, but please bear with me. Hi everyone, I'm back. Well, not back, just back for this video and maybe a couple others. And actually this video is not really about politics. It's more about thinking and how people don't think anymore, but of course that has serious implications in politics. Now, I know that saying, that I believe that something bad as like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia could happen in our day and age, it's like, okay, like a bit intense. But I'm not saying that like the same thing would happen. I'm not saying that there's gonna be, that we could definitely have another Holocaust or that we could have another famine like they did in Russia. But I'm thinking something as bad as that is plausible based on the trends we're seeing in our culture and in politics. Maybe not like that, because back then obviously they didn't have checks and balances, and we do now, at least in the United States, which would make it much harder for things to get as bad as that. But it's not impossible. And even if they didn't get to the level of a Holocaust or a famine, what if they get a quarter of the way towards something similar or that magnitude? 25% of that is still pretty bad. And I think it's not impossible. So that's what we're gonna talk about today, or what I'm gonna talk about. And this is not gonna be a 10-second TikTok video. It's gonna be kind of long. Go grab a hot chocolate, a wine, a hot toddy, some water with creatine, whatever you want. That's what YouTube is all about, long form content, and I'm here for it. Long does not mean bad. That's what she said. What? Moving on. So before I move forward, I'm gonna give you a disclaimer that I think it's pretty obvious that I am not an expert on this subject or the multiple subjects that I'm going to be talking about. I went to film school, a fancy film school, but still film school. I already know I'm not an expert, but at the same time, like, I read, I did my research, I stare thoughtfully into the horizon as thoughts come to my mind. So in a way, I do know what I'm talking about. Now, before I tell you the reasons I believe something like this could happen, let me share some crazy data that's not going to inform these things that I'm going to talk about. Maybe I'll read a little bit here from my computer so it's easier. The Nazi regime ended only 80 years ago, and it lasted 12 years. That was something that the whole world considers extremely horrendous, and yet it lasted 12 years. And it was like less than 100 years ago. So what's the difference of how people used to be that they let that happen versus people now? That's something that we're gonna discuss. The Holocaust itself only lasted about 4 years, yet it was building, right? There was a lot of build-up for it within the Nazi regime with the anti-Semitic policies and all that. So something like the Holocaust, it doesn't just happen overnight. So what if there's something that our current culture is building toward that we could possibly reverse? And also think about how like that was the Holocaust, right? Lasted about 4 years, and they had, you know, the resources that they had for their time were what they had. But nowadays our government has so much more things they could use to create something really bad, not a Holocaust, something else, but equally bad, because they have so many more resources. What could they achieve in 1 year? You really don't even need nowadays for an event to last that long for it to cause unimaginable destruction, because our weapons of mass destruction, just like political intelligence, is so much more vast. Now, another piece of data that is very interesting is that Lenin and Stalin's rule ended about 70 years ago, which also feels very recent. And it lasted 36 years, about 36 years combined, the regime, which shows you like sometimes once a bad thing gets started, it's gonna take a long time to stop it or reverse it. So that's a cautionary tale for us, like don't let it get that way, because then it's could take forever to get out of it. But even though Lenin and Stalin's regime ended about 72 years ago, the communist regime continued, and it didn't stop until 1991. Like, that basically ended about 34 years ago. Like, some millennials were already born before this thing ended. So again, all of that to say that this happened recently. Like, how much really have people changed in those 80 or 34 years? I believe we are the same. The people from back then and people now, we're the same. We have different resources available. Nowadays we have more ways to get information and whatnot, but like our brains were the same. So if that could happen to them, or if they could allow that to happen, why wouldn't people nowadays allow that to happen here too, right? So now I get to come back to my theory for why we get the candidates we get, and why I believe that's a sign of that something really bad could happen in the future. And that is because I think that people don't think. They don't deeply think anymore. Yes, people think seriously about certain things in their lives, but for some reason, when it comes to the seriousness about who to vote for and the ideologies they represent, people really don't take the time to think. And that's why I'm gonna talk about these few things that I think are like evidence that people aren't thinking. And I know that kind of sounds obvious to some people, but I think this statement, people don't think, it's more serious than it sounds. So let's just get into the things. The first thing is, again, related to the candidates that we get time and time again. It seems like every election cycle, the candidates just get worse for both sides, Democratic, Republican, and even the other parties. They just seem to get a little bit worse, sometimes a lot worse. But just take Harris and Trump. They're both so clearly, evidently unprincipled and tribal, and they have a long record of bad decisions. Yet there were people on both sides who were genuinely excited for them, who idolized them, who really thought like they were gonna save America. Some people thought Harris would do it, some people thought Trump would do it. And this is just so weird, because sure, I get that sometimes you go to the polls and a lot of people just pick one because they're like, oh, I guess I gotta pick the one that seems the least bad to me. But the fact that there are people who are actually excited for either, I just think it shows that there's something really wrong with our culture. And I think it hints at, if people are excited for these people, I feel like you start to understand the people of the past, the people who supported Hitler, or who didn't do anything to stop Lenin in Russia, there are probably people who were very excited for them back then. Just there's people who are very excited for our shitty candidates that we have right now. And not saying that our shitty candidates would do anything as bad as what, Hitler and Lenin did, but they are also evidently shitty. Just, I'm sure Hitler and Lenin were evidently bad choices, and people still supported them or enabled them back then. So what does that tell you about now and how we are? All of that leads me to point number 2, which is the tendency of people throughout the ages to downplay what candidates say, especially what the candidate that they like says. It's like when you have a friend who is in a toxic relationship and then she gets in a fight with her toxic boyfriend and he threatens to burn down her apartment, and he's just like that. He says these things, but he doesn't mean them. That's how we are, or people are, with the crazy things politicians say. Throughout history, many politicians have explicitly stated the horrible things they intend to do as soon as they get in power, and people still support them because they don't really mean it. They're just trying to make their point, right? That's just how this person talks. It's not something that only our culture in 2025, 2024 does when they hear politicians speak. This has happened since the beginning of time, where there have been elections. People rationalize, downplay the horrible things the candidates say, and that's obviously a very bad habit, but I think it's an indicator of something worse happening in our culture. For example, take Hitler, right? I haven't heard his speeches, but I did research just to figure out whether he ever explicitly said what he intended to do. And yes, there were multiple occasions where he strongly implied that he wanted to eliminate all Jews from Germany or remove them from Germany. He was looking for a permanent removal of Jews from Germany. I don't know if he ever used the words kill or exterminate, but he made it clear that he wanted to permanently remove them. And he was very clear on his hatred for them, and people still supported him. There's actually this book that I want to read, and I found it when I was doing research for this video, because I was asking myself that question. I was like, wait, back in Nazi Germany, did people know what Hitler was doing, or were they taken by surprise? Oh my gosh. Apparently, according to this book, lots of them knew, lots of them enabled it or didn't care, or they were fully on board. So I'm gonna read this because I find this interesting, this subject very interesting, how can people just go along with these things? So the book is called Backing Hitler, Consent and Coercion in Nazi Germany. So that's gonna be one of my next reads, and I'll let you know how that goes. Same thing with Soviet Russia. Lenin, Stalin, they would talk about class enemies, how they should be eliminated, and people went along because they were saying, yeah, this will get us equality, but the intent of this Lenin Stalin was very clear of how they intended to eliminate these class enemies. It wasn't just gonna be okay, get out of the country, goodbye. It was gonna be true means of violence, and they went along with this. They enabled this. And yes, nowadays we also have candidates that make some pretty wild statements about what they intend to do when they get in power, or how they feel about certain parts of society or certain people. And people either downplay it, they don't mean it, or they are down with it. And if they're down with those statements, what else won't they be down with? So what does this tell us? It just tells me like back then they were probably thinking like we would have never allow something that bad to happen, and yet they did, and they did fell for it. And like I said, we are just like them. We're the same. We have the same brains. Like why? And we probably always think we will never let it get as bad as that. It's not gonna happen to us. We're not gonna fall for it. But I think it's completely possible that it could happen to us, that we would fall for it or just coast, not fight back, and then let it happen, and then we're trapped in the bad thing. Okay, the next point that I think supports my theory has to do with the reaction that people have to world events such as October 7th massacre and, for example, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, right? With Charlie Kirk, there were so many people who were quick to reply with those memes mocking him or celebrating the assassination, mocking his death and celebrating the assassination. And I'm not gonna dive deep into this point specifically because most of what has to be said has already been said on social media and blogs and articles, like about how it's completely evil to celebrate a political assassination because you're basically endorsing political assassinations for everybody just because you don't like what people have to say. So I'm not gonna go into that, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the reaction that people had after the October 7th attacks, because it's just so crazy to me that right after that, or not too long after that, suddenly everybody is a Palestine supporter. Suddenly everybody has the flag in their bio and they have Free Palestine. Like, what a strange timing. It would be another thing. There was a huge movement about freeing Gaza, freeing Palestine or whatever before this happened, right? If people were rallying behind them before any of these horrible things were done, that would be very different. But the fact that they started supporting and getting behind Gaza and Palestine after the attacks is just, it's coming off as it's not about the oppressed, the quote unquote oppressed, or like showing support for the little guy. It's almost like they enabling the bad things that Hamas did or excusing them. The timing is wild because I'm like, I cannot say with 100% accuracy, but I'm like 95% sure that most of these people who were suddenly updating their bios to show their support for Palestine, they didn't even know what was happening there. Like, they didn't care, they didn't know. And suddenly they know after October 7th, and they chose that side, the side that committed the atrocities. What does that tell us about people and the state of the culture and the kind of horrible things people can get behind or we can get behind? And I'm sure that some people who are supporting Palestine, they really think they're doing a good thing, like they're not evil people maybe, but the timing is crazy. Oh, you didn't know about this, and now that they literally torture and raped and did all these horrible things, now you're gonna show your support for them. This is another thing of how I think it shows that now in 2025 we are no different than people back then that enabled the Nazis, the Soviets, because back then what was crazy was that all these horrible things were happening in Russia, right? Purges, famine, political assassinations, all these horrible things. Yet the West, in America, a lot of people were like, you're misjudging them. they basically were trying to make excuses for what was happening over there because they sympathize with socialism's intent. So if back then Americans were making excuses for communist Russia, it's not surprising that now people are making excuses for what the monsters did in October 7th, and now they take their side, essentially. But obviously there's a lot of ignorance going on, and again, that's the recurring theme here, the non-thinking, not thinking deeply about things, which is what leads us to just jump on the wagon of sympathy or whatever, or slogans, buy into slogans, because that's another thing. Slogans have such power, and the fact that people buy into these political slogans so easily, it's another indicator of that people are not thinking. For example, let's go back to Russia, communist Russia. The slogan back then when Lenin started to try to get in power was peace, land, bread. It sounds so nice, right? Yeah, you want peace, we'll give you land and bread. Food's important because they had food shortages. And that's what people got behind. They weren't thinking, lots of them, some of them knew exactly what they were enabling, but a lot of them didn't think the time to see what's behind this slogan, how exactly are they going to achieve this, how will it affect us, how will it affect others. They just bought into it. And in the same way, nowadays, 2025, 2024, any other previous election, people get behind the slogans. They don't really think about what's behind them. What are the implications? What are the long-term effects, short-term effects? Nothing. It's just, ooh, this sounds cool. And some people should know by now that a politician is gonna do whatever it takes to get in power, and then part of it is come up with a catchy slogan. Like, why don't we know that already, that the slogans are just slogans and they don't mean anything? Another piece of evidence that tells us that we as a people are not thinking, or that people are not thinking, it's how people react to when policies are finally enforced, right? Think of any policy right now that people are repulsed by, or any policy, whether it's a policy that is affecting us financially or that it's a policy that is affecting people's lives. Everybody is quick to be like, oh no, the man in the White House is doing this, or the government is doing this. Everybody is quick to avoid responsibility of the fact that they're the ones who voted for this, and it's never their fault. It's the fault of the government, even though obviously the government is what people endorse, what people allow to get in there in the White House. So this lack of accountability, of taking responsibility, I think that's also evidence that people are not thinking, that they evade, they choose to be blind as to feel better about themselves. And that also shows us that we are not unlike the people from the past. I am pretty sure that people from the past, when horrible things started happening in whatever country, but let's go back to Nazi Germany and like Soviet Russia, they were probably appalled, oh my gosh, after the peak of the atrocities were revealed to be happening in their countries. They're like, oh no, how can this be? Why is the government doing this? Why are these dictators doing this, when they're the ones, the people in general, who made it possible for these people to get in power in the first place? That they themselves were the ones who supported these candidates or these dictators in the first place, and then they act like they bear no responsibility. And yes, I'm sure there are many more reasons that can contribute to my theory that something horrible as horrible as Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia could happen here again or similar. There's many other things like abuse of emergency powers or the dominating ideology of a society. There's many other things that play into this, and a lot of them Ayn Rand talked about. But one thing that I think that's also very relevant and that I want to specifically talk about is our education system, which I think, since my theory is that we cannot think, it's closely related to the education system. I feel like the reason why we're not thinking and the people of the past are not thinking is because the education system has failed. I feel like it's not teaching people how to think properly for themselves, how to challenge false narratives, or how to identify false narratives. It seems like the education system just encourages to teach you what to think. They want to teach you what to think and not how to think, as if that was their job, to give you your ideas and ideals, not to give you the tools to find your own ideas and ideals. So that's why people don't have intellectual independence. That's why there's so much moral cowardice, and people feel like if they don't think the same things that everybody was taught to think in school, that they will be singled out, that they will stand alone, and it will be uncomfortable, and people don't want to be uncomfortable. Yeah, and I'm sure much more can be said about this, but that's what I have right now. Here's something crazy. If we have reached the point where candidates that we have right now are our best leaders, then we're in trouble. Because it's not like people are going to wake up and be like, wow, this person sucks, let's do better next time. Going to rationalize about the reasons why it didn't work, and they're just going to do more of the same, maybe even double down and vote for an even worse option in the future, as long as their slogan is catchy enough. Now, to close the video, I wanted to talk about what I think we could do to reverse it, and it's gonna be crazy. I'm gonna make some wild claims. This is just me thinking out loud, but I definitely want to hear what you think could be done to reverse the trend that our culture is heading toward, or if there's anything we can do to stop it getting worse. Or do you believe something as bad as Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia could happen in our day and age? But here it goes. Here's my weird theory on how I think we could reverse some of this damage that has been done. Number one is obviously if people start thinking, but realistically, I don't think we're going to get the whole country thinking overnight. I think we would be lucky if we get 25% of the country deeply thinking about the issues that are discussed every election cycle. I think that if we have 25% of the country thinking, at least one among them should be good enough to be a presidential candidate. And sure, maybe the first time they run, they don't win. But if we keep this trend going of finding good candidates among the 25% of people in our country actually thinking, and we keep promoting those candidates, eventually they will get noticed by more than just the 25% of people that actually think, and maybe they would get elected at some point. And maybe it would inspire more people to start thinking, and then we would start a trend, right, that not only 25% of the country is thinking, but more. Now, let me make another disclaimer again, is that I am well aware that I'm just assuming that the country isn't thinking. And I'm also aware that saying that if we got 25% of the country thinking, it's a little arbitrary, but I'm just coming up with this number for illustration purposes. Now, another way I think we could prevent getting ourselves into the situation where every election cycle we vote ourselves into something worse, therefore we have even worse candidates, is by being honest with ourselves. Just simple honesty. This means that if we don't want to think or don't like thinking, maybe we shouldn't vote. Maybe people who don't want to think should choose not to vote. I know that's controversial because usually we're told that the opposite thing, like every vote matters, just go out there and vote no matter what. But is that really the best approach? Is it really good to have people voting that didn't really even think, didn't really research, didn't think about the implications of the things that candidates are claiming to want to do? Maybe those of us who don't want to think, or those people who don't want to think, should just abstain from voting and let the people who really think about these things, who put in the effort, who research, let them vote, and maybe we could get better results every election cycle, and maybe that would lead us into slightly better candidates every 4 years. And I know that if put into practice, this would mean that less than half of the country would be voting. And that's pretty much what we get nowadays, no? Like half of the country votes or something. And if we were to but if people who don't want to think really didn't go vote and let the people who do think go vote, like, yeah, we would initially would have a much smaller turnout, but maybe the outcome would be better. Now, a final disclaimer, I myself, I'm not into politics at all. I don't spend a lot of time researching what politicians talk about every election cycle. I do the minimum research, like I'll go to their websites and read their policies, but I don't tune into the debates. But I personally think that I'm able to avoid the having to spend too much time keeping up with what every politician is saying because of Ayn Rand. Thanks to Ayn Rand, I have a very strong understanding of principles. So because of this very strong understanding, I can very easily sniff out whether a policy is life-affirming or anti-life, right? I don't need to know all the details to know whether it's a good policy or not. And it is this combined with a basic understanding of business, history, and common sense is what allows me to decide if a policy is good or bad without having to spend hours researching it. So that was it. Those are all the reasons why I think, regrettably, that something as bad as Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia could happen in our day and age. Like I said, maybe not to that scale, but an approximation of that. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but I'm worried, which is why I decided to make this video. And if you have other thoughts, or if you agree with me, but you think there's other reasons why this could happen, please let me know. Because I feel like there's more at play here that I would like to understand. So, thank you for watching. I'll be having another video definitely. And after that, I'm not sure. Maybe more, maybe not that many more. But yeah. Thank you for watching. Bye.